Hey, what is up everyone? Kolst here. We're back with the second iteration of viewer draft reviews. So of course, as I mentioned in the first video, which I'll put a card up for, I opened this channel in my Discord to get some submissions for some of these draft reviews I'm going to be doing. I have two of them I'm going to be doing today. Both of these were 11-win decks. One was a Death Knight and one was a Warrior that didn't have any rifts. And of course, if you want to submit it yourself, you can join Discord. I'll put a link for that in the description of this video as well. So let's get right into these picks here. Let's start with the Death Knight here. The first pick we have is a very interesting one. Hardcore Cultist versus Reef Walkers, because he's Stranger, just not quite as good as the other two cards. I have mentioned I do like, especially very early in a Death Knight draft, keeping your rune options open. So it's definitely not bad to take Cultist here, but Reef Walker was picked and I think I would do the same. Cultist is definitely good too. It's definitely not wrong, but I just like to keep my options a little bit open, get a higher chance for a Marigar or something, you know. Pick 2, we have a pretty easy pick here, Tomb Guardians, because you really like to get that double Unholy. What a great way to lock it in immediately. Easy pick there. Third pick, you have Chillfallen Baron versus Accuser. You definitely could take the Accuser for power, but it's risky. Early on, especially, I like to lock in the Chillfallen Baron, so I agree with it here. Pick 4, easy pick. Mortician is broken, so you will secure that. Pick 5, we have another interesting one though, because Howling Blast versus Corporal Psychic is not quite as good. This would lock you into Frost, which you actually want. I do believe that 2 Unholy 1 Frost is still the best combination to go, so that would lock it in. So there's definitely an argument for picking this, just so you don't get forced into a blood later, because that's very possible. You just get a blood card versus 2 terrible cards. But Corporal is picked here. I definitely don't think that's wrong either, because Corporal is a very good card, arguably better than Howling Blast, but you could definitely make a solid argument for taking the Howling Blast here. We'll move on to the next one. This is Specialist versus Infiltrator. Infiltrator is decent, but I like picking up the Specialist for that first dredge. That is what was picked as well. Next pick we have here, pretty easy pick. Vizier, by far the best card. Next pick as well, very easy pick, Army of the Dead. Another easy choice here, your Mirror Death, bring over cards that are not broken. Another pick here, yet another easy one, Acolyte of Death, just the better card than Neophyte, and also you like that Frost rune, so you get to lock it in here. Moving on, we go to another pick, another easy pick, Battlefield Necromancer. Remember when drafting was hard? We'll get to picks that are harder very soon, because actually here's an interesting one. Body Bagger versus Sidekick versus Infectious Ghoul. All of these are pretty reasonable picks here. You have some sticky things like the Tomb Guardians that could really work with the Infectious Ghoul, but I'm not the biggest fan of it, just because I think boards get dealt with a little bit too easy for it to really work. So the Body Bagger, I believe, was picked here, and I think I would agree. You don't have a great deck for Sidekick right now, so Body Bagger, just to get a good one drop, I think I agree with that. Moving on, next we have another pick here, 2 pretty weak cards, and Dredger's Staff. Don't love this card right now, but it's pretty solid, and yeah, it can help with, like, for example, the Necromancer, so I think it is the pick here, and it was picked here. Next up, we have Treasure Guard over cards that just aren't quite as good. Don't really need a 1, especially with the 2 1-drops you just took. Puffer Fist, you don't have weapons. You're not that likely to get weapons, so I think it's a pretty solid Treasure Guard pickup here. And next up, we have not the most exciting but interesting pick, because we have Glacial Advance versus Rainbow Glow Scale. These cards are, this is a pretty close pick, I think. Glacial Advance I'm just not a big fan of, because it's usually just a Shadow Bolt. Sometimes it goes face, so that's something, but I'm just not a huge fan of it. And that was picked by the viewer here, but I think I would go for the Glow Scale just to get secure in a 2-drop while you can, because I'm just not a big fan of this card personally, but I wouldn't say this is a mistake. I think I would just lean a little bit towards the 2-drop there. Because keep in mind, the Necromancer and Mortician aren't really 2-drops a lot of the time, or you'd rather play them when they're actually active, so it would be pretty nice to lock in a 2-drop right now. Moving on to the next one here, pretty easy choice. Swarm Guard is just by far the best pick here. Unfortunate when you don't have blood that you can't really get a lot of the hand buffs, but it's still a very good card, and there's some potential for synergy regardless. Next up, we have pretty easy choice, Darkfallen Shadow, the only card here that isn't completely useless. Next up here, we have an interesting one, because you have Promo Drake versus Hipster. This is a pretty close one, I think, but Promo Drake is just a little bit slow. Because you are like 2 Unholy 1 Frost, you're not going to get card removal very likely, so there's definitely an argument to take the Promo Drake there. However, especially as we mentioned before, you are kind of lacking 2-drops, so Hipster and is a good 2-drop. It's Discover. You can't really pass on Discover. I think you could go Promo Drake here, but it'd be pretty greedy, so I definitely don't disagree with the Hipster choice that was made here. Next up, we have an interesting one because you have Accuser versus Sketchy Stranger versus Clergy. Accuser is the best card because, of course, you are a Death Knight and you can hear a power to activate it, and that was picked here. I do like this pickup here. I like all these cards, but especially right now, you are a little lacking in just threats and big impact cards, so I think Accuser is the right pickup here. Next up, we have an interesting one because it's Rainbow Glowscale versus Stereo Totem, and Glowscale was picked here, but at this point you're at pick 20 and the spell damage is not looking very useful right now. It'd be one thing if you had picked up that early frost spell, specifically the Howling Blast, but you don't have that right now, so it's not doing anything. I think personally I might take the Stereo Totem here just for that potential, and again, you do have that Nerubian Swarm Guard right there, so that's a potential high roll. This is a close one, but I think for those reasons I would lean Stereo Totem here. Next up, we have an interesting choice. This is a bit of an agonizing one because these are both super good right now, Rhyme Sculptor and Shillfallen Baron. Replicating Menace just not quite as good as the other two. I think as is currently, you kind of do want an actual threat, so I like the Rhyme Sculptor. This is a bit tough just because you do have a lot of value, so you can justify skipping the Baron for that reason, but also you're still at the point where a little bit more draw would just add consistency and help you, but the Sculptor is picked, and I think that's probably what I would take here as well for that reason. Moving on to the next pick here, you have the choice really between Street Sweeper and Sin Runner. Again, you still kind of want a threat right now in the current deck, so I like the Sin Runner pickup that was made here. It would be nice to have an AoE, but this isn't really where you'd want to pick it up, I don't think. Next up, you have Unholy Frenzy versus Construct Quarter. Construct Quarter just really isn't what it used to be. I played with it and it does not feel very good. Unholy Frenzy was picked up here, and I think I absolutely agree, especially with the Rhyme Sculptor, the Baron, and some of the other things in this deck. The Unholy Frenzy can have a whole lot of synergy. Next up, kind of forced into an Accuser here, which is honestly not exactly what you want at this point after getting all those 5s. This is kind of just unfortunate draft order, but yeah, at this point you don't really have a choice. Next up, you have another Shillfallen Baron versus Silvermoon Armorer. This is very similar to that last pick, which again I would probably agonize over for the exact same reasons, but the exact same reasons I'm probably going to end up leaning a little bit towards the Armorer again. But yeah, this is another tough one, but I think you'll go for that. Another interesting one here between Body Bagger and Crooked Cook. It's another tough one because again, that little bit of extra draw would be very nice to improve the consistency of this deck, but also Body Bagger gives you, that high roll potential with the Necrotic Mortician and the Battlefield Necromancer early on, so it's a little tough to skip that right now. So I think you could take the Cook, but I can't disagree with the Body Bagger pickup here that was made. Next up, you have one where, especially with the 5-drop situation you have, I don't think you can really take the Muck Plumber here, so you're kind of forced into the Glacial Advance here. Next up, you have another pick where another Glacial Advance was picked up here, I believe. And it probably is the best card here. I just don't really love Glacial Shard, and it's a little tough to take a 2-drop over this. So I think I agree with the Glacial Advance pickup here. And next we have the big legendary pick, which is essentially Frostmourne versus Cagehead. Don't think Malygos is really what you want right now. And Cagehead was picked up here. I think this is a very tough pick. I would agonize over this for a while as well, because Frostmourne looks really nice in this deck just to have pretty much uninterruptible 15 base damage mainly, but also to have a real control win condition as well. Cagehead should be good as well, but there are just a lot of things that can interrupt it, right? If you're against a priest, they might just remove it entirely off the board before it gets to go face, for example, and you really want to have it with certain synergies, which you don't have in this deck right now. However, you do have a few discovers and ways to actually pick up some of those synergies. The one synergy you do have is that Unholy Frenzy, and I imagine that's going to be. So for me, this is a really tough call between Frostmourne and Cagehead. I think you could go either way. I think I might lean Frostmourne, but I'm not sure. I played with each of these cards only once, I think. Cagehead personally just did not feel that great for me the time I had it without very much synergy, but Your experience may differ, but that's just why I think I would lean towards the Frostmourne here. And then the last pick we have here is another easy one, just another Necrotic Mortician. Pretty straightforward pick up here. So in the end, this is the deck we ended up with. I think that although the deck was pretty kind as far as giving you a lot of premium cards, the deck was a little bit unkind in just the pick order. It would have allowed for a slightly better draft if cards were just offered in a slightly different order. And I think there were no real mistakes, but just there were a couple things that I think might have leaned the deck into a slightly better direction. But overall, I think it was a good draft. And if you're going 11 with Death Knight right now, that is very, very good. This isn't even like a super high roll, so that's a good result for this deck. So with that, let's move on to the second draft of this video, which is this 11-win Warrior that didn't have any riffs at the end. So let's start talking about these picks here. The first one here, Cruel Taskmaster, was picked here. None of these cards are bad, but Cruel Taskmaster I think is just by a little bit the best card here. I definitely wouldn't mind just grabbing the Weapons Expert here, but I can't fault you for just taking the safe tempo pick early on. You're not guaranteed to get like weapons that you can actually draw because, you know, Sword Eater and Sunfire Smithing you can't actually draw, so it's a little risky to take the other guy early there. Pick 2, we have 3 pretty good cards here as well. Power Slider was picked up. I think I like that just because, and Power Slider has been really good for me, and it gives you a bit of direction, and, you know, picking some of that high synergy stuff early on could be very rewarding, so I like that pick up here. Third pick here, pretty straightforward. I think easy Light of the Phoenix. Glow Scale's not terrible, but you have a lot of good 2-drops in Warrior typically, so you don't really need that, so I think an easy pickup here. Pick 4, you have Execute versus Cruel Taskmaster. Cruel Taskmaster is picked up here. I think I might personally take the Execute just because I find Execute hard to pick and I kind of want them. It's just a lot of times they're really hard to pick, and I think I might give up a slight amount of value here just to grab one, given that you have the other Cruel Taskmaster already. But for me, that's a very slight leaning. I wouldn't call it a mistake to skip that here, but I think that's where I would go personally. Next up here, we have the Location versus Concert Promo Drake. This was a very disciplined pick to skip the Dragon here and get the Sanguine Depths. I think that is the correct pick. You could go Promo Drake, but it's very greedy. Location's really good in Warrior, especially the first one, so I like that pickup here. Next up, you have Darkfall and Shadow versus yet another Cruel Taskmaster, especially with 2 Cruel Taskmasters. I don't want a third. And Shadow is arguably just a better card anyway, so I like that pickup that was made here. Next up, we have pretty straightforward pick here, as you definitely want the Stalwart. If you really hate people who play Fires in Ashara, you can pick Steam Cleaner, but it's a bad idea. Hopefully you're the one who actually casts it rather than your opponent anyway, right? So definitely a good pickup on the Stalwart there. Next up, you have Necrolite versus Armorer. Necrolite's usually not the best in War because you just don't tend to have that many 1-drops. So, I mean, I definitely like the Armorer. I think Armorer is arguably just a better card anyway. So a good pickup there. Next up, you have Silver Fury Stalwart again versus Stoneborn General. You could go for the General here, but I think it's probably a safer and more disciplined pick to just take the Stalwart here. You have other ways of getting huge value in Warrior, and Stalwart was picked up here, so I like that pick as well. Next pick up here, there's really only one card here worth considering, which is Mothership, and that is the pick that's taken 3 6-drops, but that's not the biggest issue in the world right now. Here, pretty straightforward pick here where Trident is just the best card, and that is the one that was picked up. So mostly straightforward drafts so far. This is the first one where it gets a little interesting because this is the first riff that was offered in this draft, and it was skipped by the viewer. As we already mentioned, no riffs were taken in this draft. There's definitely a school of thought that you take every riff right now. I don't really want to get too deep into that whole thing, but I think it'd be pretty safe to argue that riff is the right pick here. What was actually picked here is Guard the City, which probably would have been my last pick. It's interesting picking that versus Priest of the Deceased. I think I value that infused potential over that 3 armor, but I could definitely see why you might like that armor too. Opens up some synergies and stuff. But yeah, here's the potential where you could have ended up grabbing a riff. But with that, let's just move on. The next one we have here is an interesting one because you have Tuskar Trawler versus Slam. Slam is by far the superior card. The viewer did pick Tuskar Trawler here. The reason to take it is the Trident, obviously. For me, I just don't think that's enough reason. You have a lot of good mid-game plays, and it can be difficult, first of all, if you're waiting to actually dredge up the weapon. You're playing this pretty late and you're not using it as a 2-drop, and I think I think I need more than one trident for me to give up a slam here. So I would have taken the slam, but you can definitely see the value. It's just that there's other ways to grab dredges too, so you're just hoping you get one that's cheaper than having to pass on a slam here, because I really like slam right now. Next up, we have a very interesting one, because a lot of times I might automatically pick the Menace here, because normally that's the best card, but you have Location and 2 Cruel Taskmasters, and it is Undead Synergy for the Power Slayer as well, so I like the egg here actually, and the egg was picked. I think in this case I do agree with it. Yeah, it's a pretty nice egg pickup actually. Next up, we have the second rift that was offered up against Black Scale Brute. As we already mentioned, no rifts were taken, so Black Scale Brute was picked here. Right now it's a tough pick because you only have that one trident and potentially the Sunken Trident dredged up as well, so you really don't have the weapons to support this. This is another one where I feel like it may have worked out better to just have the Chorus Rift, but we'll have to see how many more weapons we can get, if we can make this really worth it or not. Because obviously you want to double up on the Bridge Rift, but if you can double up even the Chorus Rift, it can get pretty good pretty quickly, so potential would still be there. Next up, pretty straightforward pick here, which is Power Slider easily over Red Herring. Red Herring is just, I don't think, the late game card you really want to have in this class. Next up, we have a Frightened Flunky over against 2 not quite so good cards. Right now it seems like a pretty straightforward Flunky pickups. Next up, pretty easy Sword Eater, not much to talk about there. Next up, we have Nellie against 2 cards that are not Nellie. Big exciting legendary pick, but Nellie's the clear pick here, so we're just going to move on. Next up, we have another pretty easy pick, because Anima Extractor is just vastly superior to these 2 cards. And then we have yet another Rift pickup, but this one is up against the Frightened Flunky, which I definitely would have taken here, especially because you hadn't gone for Rifts up to this point. And even at this point, I would probably still take the Flunky. However, the viewer here actually took Click Clocker, which I just don't agree with. You don't have anything to justify the Battle Cry, and I don't really value 1-drops that highly in this class, so I don't really like that pickup here. I think I would just grab the Flunky, and if you did have the Rifts, it'd be interesting whether or not you would choose the Verse Rift or the Flunky. I might still take the Flunky at this point, but at that point it'd be a lot closer, but I would definitely grab the Flunky here. Next up, we have a very cool pickup, because you actually get this Weapons Expert here, which in this deck currently functions as a dredge for that weapon, at least some of the time, because you only have that one trident, so this is huge. And this is part of the reason, again, why I don't think the dredge was necessary to pick up here, because you can essentially get one here, and definitely with that synergy, it's worth taking this over the Spellbender, I believe. Next up, we have an interesting one. Light of the Phoenix versus Duster versus Tidal Revenant, all kind of pickable cards. The pick that was made here was Duster. I'm just not the biggest fan of Duster right now. It just doesn't do what you necessarily want it to. I can definitely see it given that you are kind of missing a 3-drop, but for me, like I would still be hoping that I grab one a little bit later. I think the first Tidal Revenant especially is just really nice to have. It gives you so much more survivability in your deck, so I'd have a really hard time skipping that. I think I would take the Tidal Revenant here. Next up, we have an interesting one. Party Animal versus Anima Extractor versus Flunky. And although these are all pretty good cards, Party Animal's kind of just a worse Anima Extractor most of the time. I think to clear Anima Extractor, Flunky is just, it's good, but just not as important. I think Anima adds a lot more to the deck right now. Next pick we have here, pretty straightforward Flunky, I believe. It wouldn't be terrible to just take a 5-drop for that spot. However, the Sin Runner would be good for those Power Sliders, which is, I think, why the Click Clocker was picked up earlier on. But actually, the more I think about this is making me lean quite a bit more, actually, into the Sin Runner. I definitely think you could still take the Flunky here, but honestly, I might actually take the Sin Runner here. It's a very unusual problem to not have 5-drops in Warriors, so that's an interesting one. Normally, you just don't need it, but in this case, it looks pretty good, actually. It's worth saying as well that, you know, Flunky is also just really good with the Anima Extractor, so it's very good too. This is a tough pick, actually. I don't think you can go wrong either way. Next up here, pretty straightforward Imbued Axe. Unfortunately, it potentially ruins the Trident Weapons Expert synergy, but you don't really skip Imbued Axes right now. It's just not an option. It's such an insane powerful card. Next up, we have a slightly weaker pick. I believe the pick that was made here was actually the Shield Block. I don't hate that with how the deck looks right now, but, you know, had I not taken that Duster, I think this might have been the case that I would have taken that 3-drop to fill in that curve hole here. As is, I can't really fault the shield block. I might honestly prefer the Renovator even, just because you don't have any real synergy for the shield block. Just to, you know, have a tech option, because none of these cards are really adding a whole lot to your deck right now, but that would at least be an interesting card to choose some wins that you maybe wouldn't be able to get normally, but it's hard to say. I don't think any of the picks are bad there. Next up, I think it's a pretty straightforward pick here. The Rockstar was made. That is a nice one because it's a nice Quillbore. You don't usually get Quillbores for the power slider, but yeah, 1-drop is just the best thing for your deck right now. You do have that shield block, so you could take the Bailiff, but I don't know. Yeah, I definitely like the 1-drop the most here. Pick 29 we have here, pretty easy power slider. Last thing you need is a 2-drop, so pretty straightforward one. Even though you have a lot of synergy for this Crazed Wretch, still Power Slider just adds a lot more to the deck. And the last pickup we have here is another actually pretty interesting one. I believe Flunky was picked here, and you can't blame anyone for ever taking a Flunky. However, I have to say that I would really consider taking the Clergy here, because particularly like Power Slider Clergy can make it a huge power play to value trade something pretty big and then heal up. Potentially do 2 Power Sliders and Clergy on turn 9, for example. That's a real consideration here. So I think this is an option where I might have considered skipping one of these 2-drops as well. And with that, let's look at the end version of the deck. One of the big faults of it is that you can see, as we've been kind of talking about, you ended up with too many 2-drops, and part of that is having taken that Guard the City and the Trawler earlier on. And of course, you could have had the Rifts, but you didn't get offered a Bridge Rift, so that ended up being, I think it would have worked out okay, but ended up not being a big punish having skipped them. So overall, I think the deck worked out okay, but again, it's one of those things where I think if there were like four or so picks that I think you could have done differently, that I don't think you would need to do all differently, but you could have maybe had your choice of like 2 of those, and then you could have just fit in a lot more power in this deck. And that potentially may have helped you to just not run out of steam in games where you just don't draw the Nellie, or maybe the Nellie isn't enough by itself. Because I could see that being one of the bigger problems with this deck, is if you don't draw enough of your premium top end, and if you're in a game where you just don't really pop off with like your Anima Extractors, and your opponent has a lot of value, you don't pull really far ahead, you're just not going to have the sustain. But overall, a pretty good draft, of course. Always nice to go 11 wins in a meta like this one, especially not having all of the bridge drifts and stuff. But that'd be interesting to hear what everyone thinks in the comment section below. If you like the video, don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't, and click the bell if you want to be notified for all of these videos. But yeah, thanks a lot again. We'll see you all in the next one.